Chapter 3. It was almost 3 weeks before Lewis found time to develop his pictures. He brought them up to windy Poplars the first Sunday night he came to supper. Both the house and the little fellow came out splendidly. The little fellow smiled up from the picture. "As real as life," said Rebecca Dew. "Why, he looks like you, Lewis," exclaimed Anne. "He does that," agreed Rebecca Dew, squinting at it judicially. "The minute I saw it, his face reminded me of somebody, but I couldn't think who." "Why, the eyes, the forehead, the whole expression are yours, Lewis," said Anne. "It's hard to believe I was ever such a good-looking little chap," shrugged Lewis. "I've got a picture of myself somewhere, taken when I was 8. I must hunt it out and compare it. You'd laugh to see it, Miss Shirley. I'm the most sober-eyed kid, with long curls and a lace collar, looking stiff as a ramrod. I suppose I had my head clamped in one of those 3-clawed contraptions they used to use. If this picture really resembles me, it must be only a coincidence. The little fellow can't be any relation of mine. I haven't any relative on the island now." "Where were you born?" asked Aunt Kate. "N.B. Father and mother died when I was 10, and I came here to live with a cousin of mother's. I called her Aunt Ida. She died too, 3 years ago." "Jim Armstrong came from New Brunswick," said Rebecca Dew. "He ain't a real islander. Wouldn't be such a crank if he was. We have our peculiarities, but we're civilized." "I'm not sure that I want to discover a relation in the amiable Mr. Armstrong," grinned Lewis, attacking Aunt Chatty's cinnamon toast. "However, I think when I get the photograph finished and mounted, I'll take it out to Glen Cove Road myself and investigate a little. He may be a distant cousin or something. I really know nothing about my mother's people. If she had any living. I've always been under the impression that she hadn't. Father hadn't, I know. If you take the picture out in person, won't the little fellow be a bit disappointed over losing his thrill of getting something through the post office?" said Anne. "I'll make it up to him. I'll send him something else by mail." The next Saturday afternoon, Lewis came driving along the Spooks Lane in an antiquated buggy behind a still more antiquated mare. "I'm going out to Glen Cove to take little Teddy Armstrong his picture, Miss Shirley. If my dashing turnout doesn't give you heart failure, I'd like to have you come too. I don't think any of the wheels will fall off." "Where on earth did you pick up that relic, Lewis?" demanded Rebecca Dew. "Don't poke fun of my gallant steed, Miss Dew. Have some respect for age. Mr. Bender lent me both mare and buggy on condition I'd do an errand for him along the Dawlish Road. I hadn't time to walk out to Glen Cove today and back." "Time," said Rebecca Dew. "I could walk there and back myself faster than that animal." "And carry a bag of potatoes back for Mr. Bender, you wonderful woman?" Rebecca Dew's red cheeks grew even redder. "It ain't nice to make fun of your elders," she said rebukingly. Then, by way of coals of fire, "Could you do with a few doughnuts before you start out?" The white mare, however, developed surprising powers of locomotion when they were once more out in the open. Anne giggled to herself as they jogged along the road. What would Mrs. Gardiner or even Aunt Jamesina say if they could see her now? Well, she didn't care. It was a wonderful day for a drive through a land that was keeping its old lovely ritual of autumn, and Lewis was a good companion. Lewis would attain his ambitions. Nobody else of her acquaintance, she reflected, would dream of asking her to go driving the Bender buggy behind the Bender mare, but it never occurred to Lewis that there was anything odd about it. What difference how you were traveled as long as you got there? The calm rims of the upland hills were as blue, the roads as red, the maples as gorgeous, no matter what vehicle you rode in. Lewis was a philosopher and cared as little what people might say as he did when some of the high school pupils called him sissy because he did housework for his board. Let them call. Some day the laugh would be on the other side. His pockets might be empty, but his head wasn't. Meanwhile, the afternoon was an ideal, and they were going to see the little fellow again. They told Mr. Bender's brother-in-law about their errand when he put the bag of potatoes in the back of the buggy. "Do you mean to say you've got a photo of little Teddy Armstrong?" exclaimed Mr. Merrill. "That I have, and a good one." Lewis unwrapped it and held it proudly. "I don't believe a professional photographer could have taken a better." Mr. Merrill slapped his leg resoundingly. "Well, if that don't beat all, why, little Teddy Armstrong is dead." "Dead!" exclaimed Anne in horror. "Oh, Mr. Merrill, no. Don't tell me that dear little boy." "Sorry, miss, but it's a fact, and his father is just about wild and all the worse that he hasn't gotten any kind of picture of him at all. And now you've got a good one. Well, well. It seems impossible," said Anne, her eyes full of tears. She was seeing the slender little figure waving his farewell from the dike. "Sorry to say it's only too true. He died nearly 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia. Suffered awful, but he was just as brave and patient as anyone could be, they say. I don't know what'll become of Jim Armstrong now. They say he's like a crazy man, just moping and muttering to himself all the time. If only I had a picture of my little fellow, he keeps saying. I'm sorry for that man, said Mrs. Merrill suddenly. She had not hitherto spoken, standing by her husband, a gaunt, square-built gray woman in wind-whipped calico and check apron. He's well-to-do, and I've always felt he looked down on us because we were poor. But we have our boy, and it don't never matter how poor you are as long as you've got something to love. Anne looked at Mrs. Merrill with a new respect. Mrs. Merrill was not beautiful, but as her sunken gray eyes met Anne's, something of spirit kinship was acknowledged between them. Anne had never seen Mrs. Merrill before and never saw her again, but she always remembered her as a woman who had attained to the ultimate secret of life. You were never too poor as long as you had something to love. The golden day was spoiled for Anne. Somehow the little fellow had won her heart in their brief meeting. She and Louis drove in silence down the Glen Cove road and up the grassy lane. Carlo was lying on the stone before the blue door. He got up and came down over to them as they descended from the buggy, licking Anne's hand and looking up at her with big, wistful eyes as if asking for news of his little playmate. The door was open, and in the dim room beyond they saw a man with his head bowed on the table. At Anne's knock, he startled up and came to the door. She was shocked at the change in him. He was hollow-cheeked, haggard, and unshaven, and his deep-set eyes flashed with a fitful fire. She expected a repulse at first, but he seemed to recognize her, for he said listlessly, "So you're back." The little fellow said you talked to him and kissed him. He liked you. I was sorry I'd been so churlish to you. What is it you want? We want to show you something, said Anne gently. Will you come in and sit down? He said drearily. Without a word, Louis took the little fellow's picture from its wrappings and held it out to him. He snatched it up, gave it one amazed, hungry look, then dropped on his chair and burst into tears and sobs. Anne had never seen a man weep so before. She and Louis stood in mute sympathy until he had regained his self-control. "Oh, you don't know what this means to me," he said brokenly at last. "I hadn't any picture of him, and I'm not like other folks. I can't recall a face. I can't see faces as most folks can in their mind. It's been awful since the little fellow died, and I couldn't even remember what he looked like. And now you've brought me to this, after I was so rude to you. Sit down, sit down. I wish I could express my thanks in some way. I guess you've saved my reason, maybe my life." "Oh, miss, isn't it like him? You'd think he was going to speak. My dear little fellow, how am I going to live without him? I've nothing to live for now. First his mother, now him." "He was a dear little lad," said Anne tenderly. "That he was, little Teddy. Theodore, his mother named him. Her gift of God, she said he was, and he was so patient and never complained. Once he smiled up in my face and said, 'Dad, I think you've been mistaken in one thing, just one. I guess there is a heaven, isn't there?' 'Isn't there, Dad?' I said to him, 'Yes, there was.' God forgive me for ever trying to teach him anything else. He smiled again, contented-like, and said, 'Well, Dad, I'm going there, and Mother and God are there, so I'll be pretty well off. But I'm worried about you, Dad. You'll be so awful lonesome without me, but just do the best you can and be polite to folks and come to us by and by.' He made me promise I'd try, but when he was gone I couldn't stand the blankness of it. I'd have gone mad if you hadn't brought me this. It won't be so hard now." He talked about his little fellow for some time, and as if he found relief and pleasure in it. His reserve and gruffness seemed to have fallen from him, like a garment. Finally, Louis produced a small faded photograph of himself and showed it to him. "Have you ever seen anybody who looked like that, Mr. Armstrong?" asked Anne. Mr. Armstrong peered at it in perplexity. "It's awful like little fellow," he said at last. "Whose might it be?" "Mine," said Louis, "when I was 7 years old. It was because of the strange resemblance to Teddy that Miss Shirley made me bring it to show you. I thought it possible that you and I or the little fellow might be some distant relation. My name is Louis Allen, and my father was George Allen. I was born in New Brunswick." James Armstrong shook his head. Then he said, "What was your mother's name?" "Mary Gardner." James Armstrong looked at him for a moment in silence. "She was my half-sister," he said at last. "I hardly knew her, never saw her but once. I was brought up in an uncle's family after my father's death. My mother married again and moved away. She came to see me once and brought her little daughter. She died soon after, and I never saw my half-sister again. When I came over to the island to live, I lost all trace of her. You are my nephew, and the little fellow's cousin." This was surprising news to a lad who had fancied himself alone in the world. Lewis and Anne spent the whole evening with Mr. Armstrong, and found him to be a well-read and intelligent man. Somehow, they both took a liking to him. His former inhospitable reception was quite forgotten, and they saw only the real worth of the character and temperament below the unpromising shell that had hitherto concealed them. "Of course the little fellow couldn't have loved his father so much if it hadn't been so," said Anne, as she and Lewis drove back to Windy Poplars through the sunset. When Lewis Allen went the next weekend to see his uncle, the latter said to him, "Lad, come and live with me. You are my nephew, and I can do well for you, what I'd have done for my little fellow if he'd lived. You're alone in the world, and so am I. I need you. I'll grow hard and bitter again if I live here alone. I want you to help me keep my promise to the little fellow. His place is empty. Come, you, and fill it." "Well, thank you, Uncle. I'll try," said Lewis, holding out his hand. "And bring that teacher of yours here once in a while. I like that girl." The little fellow liked her. "Dad," he said to me, "I didn't think I'd ever like anybody but you to kiss me, but I liked it when she did. There was something in her eyes, Dad." Chapter 4. "The old porch thermometer says it's 0, and the new side door one says it's 10 above," remarked Anne one frosty December night, "so I don't know whether to take my muff or not." "Better go by the old thermometer," said Rebecca Dew cautiously. "It's probably more used to our climate. Where are you going this cold night anyway?" "I'm going round to Temple Street to ask Catherine Brooke to spend the Christmas holidays with me at Green Gables." "You'll spoil your holidays then," said Rebecca Dew solemnly. "She'd go about snubbing the angels, that one. That is, if she ever condescended to enter heaven. And the worst of it is, she's proud of her bad manners. Thinks it shows her strength of mind, no doubt." "My brain agrees with every word you say, but my heart simply won't," said Anne. "I feel, in spite of everything, that Catherine Brooke is only a shy, unhappy girl under her disagreeable rind. I can never make any headway with her in Summerside, but if I can get her to Green Gables, I believe it will thaw her out." "You won't get her. She won't go," predicted Rebecca Dew. "Probably she'll take it as an insult to be asked. Think you're offering her charity. We asked her here once to Christmas dinner, the year afore you came. You remember, Mrs. Montgomery, the year we had 2 turkeys give us and didn't know how we was to get 'em ate, and all she said was, 'No, thank you. If there's anything I hate, it's the word Christmas.'" "That is so dreadful. Hating Christmas? Something has to be done, Rebecca Dew. I'm going to ask her, and I have a queer feeling in my thumbs that she tells me she will come." "Somehow," said Rebecca Dew reluctantly, "when you say a thing is going to happen, a body believes it will. You haven't got a second sight, have you? Captain Montgomery's mother had it. You used to give me the creeps." "I don't think I have anything that need give you creeps. It's only just, I've had a feeling for some time that Catherine Brooke is almost crazy with loneliness under her bitter outside, and that my invitation will come pat to the psychological moment, Rebecca Dew." "I'm not a B.A., said Rebecca with awful humility, "and I do not deny your right to use words I cannot always understand. Neither do I deny that you can wind people round your little finger. Look how you manage the Pringles. But I do say I pity you if you take that iceberg and nutmeg grater combined home with you for Christmas." Anne was by no means as confident as she pretended to be during her walk to Temple Street. Catherine Brooke had really been unbearable of late. Again and again, Anne, rebuffed, had said as grimly as Poe's raven, "Nevermore." Only yesterday, Catherine had been positively insulting at a staff meeting, but in an unguarded moment, Anne had seen something looking out of the older girl's eyes, a passionate, half-frantic something like a caged creature mad with discontent. Anne spent the first half of the night trying to decide whether to invite Catherine Brooke to Green Gables or not. Finally, she fell asleep with her mind irrevocably made up. Catherine's landlady showed Anne into the parlor and shrugged a fat shoulder when she asked for Miss Brooke. "I'll tell her you're here, but I don't know if she'll come down. She's sulking. I told her at dinner tonight that Mrs. Rollins says it's scandalous the way she dresses for a teacher in Summerside High, and she took it high and mighty as usual." "I don't think you should have told Miss Brooke that," said Anne reproachfully. "But I thought she ought to know," said Mrs. Dennis somewhat waspishly. "Did you also think she ought to know that Inspector said she was one of the best teachers in the Maritimes?" asked Anne. "Or didn't you know it?" "Oh, I heard it, but she's stuck up enough now without making her any worse. Proud's no name for it, though what she's got to be proud of, I dunno. Of course she was mad anyhow tonight because I said she couldn't have a dog. She's took a notion into her head she'd like to have a dog. She said she'd pay for his rations and see he was no bother, but what I do with him when she was in school. I put my foot down. I'm boarding no dogs, says I." "Oh, Mrs. Dennis, Won't you let her have a dog? He wouldn't bother you much. You could keep him in the basement while she was in school. And a dog really is such a protection at night. I wish you would, please. There was something about Anne Shirley's eyes when she said please that people found hard to resist. Mrs. Dennis, in spite of fat shoulders and a meddlesome tongue, was not unkind at heart. Catherine Brooke simply got under her skin at times with her ungracious ways. I don't know why you should worry as to her having a dog or not. I didn't know you were such friends. She hasn't had any friends. I never had such an unsociable boarder. I think that is why she wants a dog, Mrs. Dennis. None of us can live without some kind of companionship. Well, it's the first human thing I've noticed about her, said Mrs. Dennis. I don't know. I have any awful objection to a dog, but she sort of vexed me with her sarcastic way of asking. I suppose you wouldn't consent if I asked you if I might have a dog, Mrs. Dennis, she says, haughty-like. Set her up with it. You're supposing right, says I, as haughty as herself. I don't like eating my words any more than most people, but you can tell her she can have a dog if she'll guarantee he won't misbehave in the parlor. Anne did not think the parlor could be much worse if the dog did misbehave. She eyed the dingy lace curtains and the hideous purple roses on the carpet with a shiver. I'm sorry for anyone who has to spend Christmas in a boarding house like this, she thought. I don't wonder Catherine hates the word. I'd like to give this place a good airing. It smells of 1,000 meals. Why does Catherine go on boarding here when she has a good salary? She says you can come up, was the message Mrs. Dennis brought back rather dubiously, for Miss Brooke had run true to form. The narrow, steep stair was repellent. It didn't want you. Nobody would go up who didn't have to. The linoleum in the hall was worn to shreds. The little back hall bedroom where Anne presently found herself was even more cheerless than the parlor. It was lighted by one glaring, unshaded gas jet. There was an iron bed with a valley in the middle of it and a narrow, sparsely draped window looking out on a backyard garden where a large crop of tin cans flourished. But beyond it was a marvelous sky and a row of Lombardy standing out against long, purple, distant hills. Oh, Miss Brooke, look at the sunset, said Anne rapturously from the squeaky, cushionless rocker to which Catherine had ungraciously pointed her. I've seen a good many sunsets, said the latter, coldly, without moving. Condescending to me with your sunsets, she thought bitterly. You haven't seen this one. No two sunsets are alike. Just sit down here and let it sink into our souls, thought Anne. Do you ever say anything pleasant? Don't be ridiculous, please. The most insulting words in the world. With an added edge of insult in Catherine's contemptuous tones, Anne turned from her sunset and looked at Catherine, much more than half inclined to get up and walk out. But Catherine's eyes looked a trifle strange. Had she been crying? Surely not. You couldn't imagine Catherine Brooke crying. You don't make me feel very welcome, Anne said slowly. I can't pretend things. I haven't your notable gift for doing the Queen act, saying exactly the right thing to everyone. You're not welcome. What sort of room is this to welcome anyone to? Catherine made a scornful gesture at the faded walls, the shabby bare chairs, and the wobbly dressing table with its petticoat of limp muslin. It isn't a nice room, but why do you stay here if you don't like it? Oh, why? Why? You wouldn't understand. It doesn't matter. I don't care what anybody thinks. What brought you here tonight? I don't suppose you came just to soak in the sunset. I came to ask if you would spend the Christmas holidays with me at Green Gables. Now, thought Anne, for another broadside of sarcasm, I do wish she'd sit down at least. She just stands there as if waiting for me to go. But there was silence for a moment. Then Catherine said slowly, Why do you ask me? It isn't because you like me. Even you couldn't pretend that. It's because I can't bear to think of any human being spending Christmas in a place like this, said Anne candidly. The sarcasm came then. Oh, I see. A seasonable outburst of charity. I'm hardly a candidate for that yet, Miss Shirley. Anne got up. She was out of patience with this strange, aloof creature. She walked across the room and looked Catherine squarely in the eyes. Catherine Brooke, whether you know it or not, what you want is a good spanking. They gazed at each other for a moment. It must have relieved you to say that, said Catherine. But somehow the insulting tone had gone out of her voice. There was even a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth. It has, said Anne. I've been wanting to tell you just that for some time. I didn't ask you to Green Gables out of charity. You know that perfectly well. I told you my true reason. Nobody ought to spend Christmas here. The very idea is indecent. You asked me to Green Gables just because you are sorry for me. I am sorry for you, because you've shut out life, and now life is shutting you out. Stop it, Catherine. Open your doors to life, and life will come in. The Anne Shirley version of the old bromide. If you bring a smiling visage to the glass, you meet a smile, said Catherine with a shrug. Like all bromides, that's absolutely true. Now, are you coming to Green Gables, or are you not? What would you say if I accepted to yourself, not to me? I'd say you're showing the first faint glimmer of common sense I'd ever detected in you, retorted Anne. Catherine laughed, surprisingly. She walked across to the window, scowled at the fiery streak, which was all that was left of the scorned sunset, and then turned. Very well. I'll go. Now you can go through the motions of telling me you're delighted and that we'll have a jolly time. I am delighted, but I don't know if you'll have a jolly time or not. That will depend a good deal on yourself, Miss Brooke. Oh, I'll behave myself decently. You'll be surprised. You won't find me a very exhilarating guest, I suppose, but I promise you I won't eat with my knife or insult people when they tell me it's a fine day. I tell you frankly that the only reason I'm going is because even I can't stick the thought of spending the holidays here alone. Mrs. Dennis is going to spend Christmas week with her daughter in Charlottetown. It's a bore to think of getting my own meals. I'm a rotten cook, so much of the triumph is matter over mind. But will you give me your word of honor that you won't wish me a Merry Christmas? I just don't want to be merry at Christmas. I won't, but I can't answer for the twins. I'm not going to ask you to sit down here, you'd freeze, but I see that there's a very fine moon in place of your sunset, and I'll walk home with you and help you to admire it if you like. I do like, said Anne, but I want to impress on your mind that we have much finer moons in Avonlea. So she's going, said Rebecca Dew as she filled Anne's hot water bottle. Well, Miss Shirley, I hope you'll never try to induce me to turn Mohammedan, because you'll likely succeed. Where is that cat? Out frisking round Summerside and the weather at 0. Not by the new thermometer, and Dusty Miller is curled up on the rocking chair by my stove in the tower, snoring with happiness. Ah, well, said Rebecca Dew with a little shiver as she shut the kitchen door. I wish everyone in the world was as warm and sheltered as we are tonight.